He thought he was doing his usual rounds, but behind a rock, he found an entrance that wasn't on the map. Inside was a temple, hidden for thousands of years, and scrolls that people would go to great lengths to obtain. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The mountains of northern Arizona held a silence that could unsettle even the most seasoned traveler. But for Ethan Harper, that silence had long ago become a familiar companion. On most days it comforted him. It wrapped around him like an old blanket, steady and predictable, without questions or expectations. Yet on the evening when everything began, the silence felt different. Too alert, too watchful, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Ethan sensed it the moment he stepped out of the ranger station and felt the cooling air brush over his face. He paused for a moment on the wooden steps, letting his eyes adjust to the fading light. The horizon glowed with the remnants of sunset, a narrow ribbon of gold pressed against jagged black peaks. Night was coming quickly, swallowing the color from the sky, and with it came the responsibilities that had shaped his life for nearly 2 decades. He adjusted the straps on his pack and walked toward his truck, feeling the familiar tug of duty settle onto his shoulders. He had patrolled these ranges for 17 years. He had memorized every bend of the trails, every clearing, every washout from summer storms. He knew where the deer crossed the riverbeds, where mountain lions made their dens beneath overhanging stone, where tourists often wandered off the marked paths even after reading the bright caution signs posted at every turn. This land was as much a part of him as the scar on his left hand, or the crease between his eyebrows that deepened whenever he tried to hide exhaustion. And yet, for all that familiarity, tonight the mountains felt foreign, as though they were rearranging themselves in ways only they could understand. He climbed into the truck and started the engine. A low rumble vibrated through the frame, steady and grounding. The radio crackled once before settling into a static hum. The dispatch board had recorded 3 separate reports of strange light phenomena during the past week, brief flashes, almost like silent lightning, deep in the canyon systems, accessible only by narrow footpaths. Tourists reported them first, describing the lights as silent bursts of white, occasionally tinted blue or green, fading so quickly that anyone who blinked would miss them. At first, Ethan assumed it was nothing more than reflections from the distant highway, or perhaps the work of a careless camper using a high-powered flashlight. But the highway was too far, too low, and the canyon walls too uneven for reflections to travel in clean lines. The campers had been questioned. None admitted to wrongdoing, and their gear proved they lacked the kind of equipment needed to generate such light. Then, 2 of Ethan's fellow rangers, men with years of experience, reported sensing faint vibrations beneath the ground, rhythmic, subtle, like the hum of distant machinery. That was the detail Ethan couldn't dismiss. There were no industrial sites for miles, no mining operations, no hidden facilities, despite persistent rumors in tourist blogs. The land was protected, monitored, and fiercely contested by preservationists. The mountains should have been quiet, perfectly quiet. He shifted the truck into gear and began the ascent along the dirt road winding into the pines. His headlights carved narrow tunnels of light through the trees. The air smelled of late summer resin and dust, mingled with the faint chill that signaled the arrival of autumn. Ethan found himself listening more closely than usual, searching for something in the familiar sounds of gravel crunching beneath tires. He wasn't sure what he expected to hear. Perhaps he didn't expect to hear anything at all, only to feel it. The emptiness in his life had sharpened his instincts. Ever since the divorce, he had thrown himself into work with a determination that bordered on obsession. Long hours, night patrols, volunteer shifts, anything to stay on the move, to keep from returning to the empty house with its hollow walls that echoed with memories he didn't want to recall. He knew it was not a healthy way to live, but the mountains were kinder than people. They demanded nothing except respect. When he reached the trailhead, he parked the truck and stepped out, inhaling the crisp air. The last hint of warm daylight flickered between the trees. Beyond them lay a network of paths that twisted into the hills, paths he could navigate blindfolded. He checked his flashlights, tightened the straps on his holster and pack, and began walking. The terrain rose gently at first, then sharply, forcing him to climb over embedded roots and slabs of weathered limestone. It was a path he had taken hundreds of times without incident. But tonight, even the familiar shapes of boulders looked subtly misaligned, as if the earth had shifted while no one was watching. As he moved deeper into the woods, the temperature dropped suddenly, far too quickly for a warm desert evening. His breath formed faint mist, dissolving almost immediately. He paused and scanned the surroundings, listening. There was no wind, not even a whisper through the pine needles. The silence pressed against his ears. That was when he noticed the ground itself seemed unsettled. Small stones had been displaced from their usual resting spots. A thick root, normally buried beneath soil, protruded awkwardly, as though the earth above it had been pushed aside recently. Ethan continued walking until the path bent toward a steep rise of stone that marked the boundary between the trail and the deeper ravines. He always paused here, partly out of habit, partly to enjoy the view. From this vantage point, the forest opened like a living map, each tree a pin marking familiar territory. But tonight, something else caught his eye. A large boulder he'd seen 1,000 times before had shifted. Not far, only a few feet, but enough to break the clean alignment he knew by heart. He moved closer, aiming his flashlight at the stone. It was heavy, far too heavy to be moved by an animal or average hiker. There were no tracks, no scrape marks, nothing to indicate how or why it had changed position. But directly behind it was something he had never seen on this trail, a narrow vertical slit in the rock face. He approached cautiously, lowering himself to inspect the opening. It was barely wide enough to slip a shoulder through, but it was clearly a natural fissure that had widened recently. The air seeping from it was cold, unnaturally cold, carrying a faint scent of mineral dust, and something older, something almost metallic. Ethan raised his flashlight and shined it inside. The beam disappeared into darkness that swallowed the light quicker than it should. And then, faintly, the sound reached him. A soft, delicate ringing, almost like thin ceramic tapping against stone. He froze. There was no wind inside the crevice, no reason for anything to move. Yet the sound came again, subtle but unmistakable. Ethan's instincts tightened around him like a vice. He knew what animals sounded like in caves, what shifting sediment or dripping water might produce. But this was different, too deliberate, too fragile. Something human-made was inside. He straightened and studied the gap. The mountains here had been explored countless times, mapped thoroughly by geologists, rangers, and historians. If there were caves, they were documented. This fissure wasn't. It felt newly revealed, as if the mountain had shifted just enough to uncover a secret it had guarded for centuries. Ethan hesitated. Entering unknown terrain alone was dangerous, especially without backup. But something inside him, an instinct deeper than training, pulled him forward. He reached cautiously into the crevice, gripping the rough edges, and tested the stability. The rock held firm. With a controlled exhale, he slid one shoulder through the gap, turning his body sideways until he squeezed through. The stone scraped slightly against his jacket, leaving a faint streak of dust across the fabric. Inside, the air became even colder. The narrow passageway extended several feet before widening into a small chamber. Ethan crouched low, scanning the ground with his light. The floor was uneven, but in several places it was unnervingly smooth, as if shaped by hands rather than nature. He moved slowly, listening to the rhythmic thump of his heartbeat, echo in his ears. Then his boot nudged something small and loose near the edge of the chamber. He watched as the object a pebble rolled forward and dropped into a darker space just ahead. The sharp crack that followed made him flinch. It was the sound of pottery shattering. He moved quickly toward the source of the noise, lifting his flashlight. The beam flickered across the chamber until it illuminated fragments of reddish clay scattered across the stone floor. And then, as he raised the light farther, he saw them. Rows of tall clay jars lined neatly against the far wall, each covered in an undisturbed layer of dust, so thick it appeared almost like gray velvet. The vessels were ancient. He could tell instantly from the shape, from the wear, from the faint etchings carved into the clay. But what stunned him even more was how intact they were, sealed with hardened lids that looked as though no human hand had touched them in hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. His breath caught in his throat. He approached one of the jars slowly, aware that he had stumbled upon something extraordinary. There were no markings of modern entry. No footprints aside from his own, no discarded trash, no signs of vandalism. The room was a time capsule, a perfect preservation of something ancient. He reached out and brushed the dust from the nearest vessel, revealing a symbol etched near the rim. His beam lingered on the marking, and a faint tremor ran through him. He knew this symbol. He had seen it once, years ago, during military service. It had been buried in a classified briefing about anomalous findings near an off-limits canyon. The officers had dismissed the glyphs as natural erosion, but Ethan had sensed even then that they were lying or hiding something. Now here it was before him, carved clearly and deliberately into an ancient vessel. His pulse quickened. Carefully, with steady hands honed by years of handling delicate rescues, he lifted the lid of the jar. It resisted slightly before giving way with a dry crack. Inside, nestled in darkness, lay a rolled piece of leather or hide, preserved so perfectly it looked as flexible as the day it was made. He reached into the jar and lifted it gently. The texture was dry, but not brittle. Warm from his touch, the ancient leather unfurled slightly at the edge, revealing lines of ink symbols arranged with purposeful repetition. He leaned closer. The writing was unfamiliar, not matching any alphabet he recognized. But it was structured. This was no random artwork. It was a language, a living record from a people he couldn't yet imagine. He swallowed hard. His breath sounded too loud in the silence of the chamber. Something about the place felt inhabited, not by living creatures, but by memory, by the weight of history pressing through the walls. As he examined the symbols, a soft prickle crept up his spine. He straightened and swept the flashlight toward the back of the chamber. The darkness there felt different, denser, deeper. For a moment he could have sworn he saw movement, like a shadow pulling back just beyond the reach of his light. His heart thudded harder. He took a step forward, holding the beam steady, but the darkness revealed nothing. Still, the sensation of being watched clung to him. He turned back toward the jars and carefully reassembled the lid onto the one he had opened. Begrudgingly, he placed the scroll into his pack, something he never would have allowed himself to do under ordinary circumstances. But this wasn't ordinary. Nothing about this discovery was ordinary. And the cold certainty forming in his chest told him that whatever he had found was bigger than his training, bigger than his job, and dangerous to leave behind unattended. He moved back toward the crevice, the scroll secure in his pack, and felt the chamber sigh around him as if reluctant to let him go. The moment he stepped back into the night air, warmth rushed over him again, and the silence of the forest returned. But it no longer felt comforting. Too much had changed inside that cave. Ethan paused, glancing back at the fissure, at the mountains rising above him like silent sentinels. The wind finally stirred, whispering through the pines. and for the first time in years, he felt as though the land he loved so deeply had turned toward him, watching, waiting, holding secrets he had only just begun to uncover. He adjusted his pack and started back toward the trail, the weight of the scroll pressing against him like a heartbeat. The mountains were no longer quiet. They had spoken to him tonight, and he had no idea what they expected of him next. Ethan barely slept that night. Even after he returned from the mountains and shut the door of his cabin behind him, the coldness of the cave clung to his skin like a second layer, refusing to let him forget what he had seen. He hung his jacket on the back of a chair and stood motionless for a moment in the middle of his small living room, staring at nothing. The lights were warm, the room familiar. Soft lamplight on wooden walls, a half-finished mug of coffee next to a folded paper map on the table. But the familiarity brought him no comfort. Everything felt out of joint, as though the world had turned a fraction of a degree, and he alone had noticed. He moved toward the table, pulled out the old leather scroll from his pack, and laid it gently on the surface. His fingers hovered over it before making contact. The material had softened in the heat of his body, no longer as stiff as when he discovered it. It seemed impossibly old, yet resilient, as if the hands that shaped it had intended it to endure centuries. He unrolled several inches carefully. Inked symbols lined the ancient hide, arranged in clean rows that curved and branched with deliberate rhythm. The symbols were unlike anything found in modern anthropology databases. Ethan knew enough about indigenous scripts, about archaic coding systems, even about obscure substitution languages used in classified military documentation. But this was none of them. And yet, there was something hauntingly familiar about the way the symbols were organized, the spacing between them, the repeated motifs. He tried to shake the feeling but couldn't. He told himself he would study it more thoroughly later, after some rest. He needed a clear mind for the morning shift. But when he tried to sleep, his dreams drifted back into the darkness of the cave. He saw shapes moving along the walls, shadows stretching into impossible silhouettes, and the faint echo of ceramic tapping against stone. At one point, he startled awake, certain someone had spoken his name just outside the window. But when he stood in the cold kitchen, looking out into the moonlit forest, he saw nothing. At dawn, when most of the sky was still gray, he made coffee and forced himself through the routine of preparing for work. He tucked the scroll safely into a steel lockbox he kept beneath the floorboards, then closed the hatch and rolled the rug back over it. When he stepped outside to start his truck, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with an unspoken warning. The drive to the station took only a few minutes, but halfway there, Ethan felt a strange, prickling sensation crawl along the back of his neck. He glanced at his rearview mirror and saw headlights in the distance. 2, maybe 3 vehicles following him. The road was isolated, rarely used this early in the morning. He slowed slightly, letting the vehicles close the gap. They weren't park rangers. The trucks were black, clean, with tinted windows that revealed nothing of the drivers. They followed without rushing, without falling back. Just steady, purposeful pursuit. Ethan controlled his breathing and kept driving. Perhaps they were government inspectors, he told himself, or officials from the archaeology department. But he knew better. No archaeology team drove unmarked armored SUVs into a national forest at dawn, and no one arrived without first calling ahead. By the time he pulled into the ranger station parking lot, the trucks had already turned into the clearing behind him. 3 men stepped out. They were dressed in dark uniforms with no visible insignia. Their faces were unreadable, the kind of expressionless calm that came from years of practiced authority. One of them approached Ethan before he could even set his coffee down. "Ranger Harper?" the man asked. His voice was flat and controlled, neither friendly nor hostile. It carried the tone of someone used to being obeyed. "Yes," Ethan said carefully. "Can I help you?" Your presence is required for a matter of federal concern." The man extended a badge briefly, almost too quickly for Ethan to analyze, but the shine of the metal was enough to suggest legitimacy. "We've been informed of your discovery yesterday." Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Discovery. "The cave," the man said, "and its contents." Another man stepped forward. "You will lead us there immediately." Ethan inhaled slowly, buying time to think. "My supervisor, shouldn't he be informed?" "We already handled that," the first man replied. "He understands the sensitivity of the situation." There was no room for refusal. Ethan nodded once, masking his unease, and walked ahead of them to his truck. They gestured for him to ride with them instead. He hesitated only a second before complying. Inside the SUV, the air smelled of chemical-scented leather, cold metal, and something faintly medicinal. No one spoke. The engine hummed quietly, far quieter than a vehicle of its size should. Ethan watched through the window as the trees blurred past. It felt like traveling inside a sealed container, escorted by men who belonged to an agency that did not officially exist. When they reached the trailhead, the men walked ahead with confident strides, as though they already knew the direction. Ethan guided them up the slope, though he sensed they didn't truly need him. They heeded his instructions only when the path narrowed or the ground loosened. But when they reached the boulder and the fissure behind it, Ethan saw something that made his pulse kick. One of the men muttered. It finally gave way. Not with surprise, more with grim inevitability. He knows this place, Ethan thought. They've been looking for this entrance. The men entered the crevice without hesitation, flashlights slicing through the darkness. Ethan followed reluctantly, feeling the cold envelop him once more. But when they reached the chamber, he stopped short. It was not the same as he had left it. Several jars were gone, not knocked over, not broken gone. The dust patterns were disturbed. Footprints, heavy ones, marked the ground, overlapping his own from the night before. Someone had been here, likely very recently. The men exchanged looks, but said nothing. Their silence said everything. "It seems someone else found this before us," Ethan said, testing their reactions. The man beside him turned with a faint, humorless smile. "Don't concern yourself with that." His voice remained calm, but Ethan sensed the warning beneath the words. "Show us the rest." "There is no rest," Ethan answered. "This chamber is all I found." The man stepped closer. His eyes were dark and unreadable. "Let me rephrase. There should be a secondary cavity, an inner recess. Show it to us." Ethan's heart hammered. They knew exactly what to look for. They knew the structure of the cave better than he did. But he had no intention of revealing the small, hidden niche he had discovered. He couldn't explain why he felt protective of it, only that something deep inside urged caution. "There is no secondary cavity," Ethan repeated. The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, as though filing away the lie for later. "Very well," he said. "We'll continue without your help." They searched the chamber thoroughly, checking fissures and striking the walls for hollow echoes. Ethan watched their precision, the synchronized movements born from years of specialized training. They were not archaeologists. They were operatives. This discovery was not new to them. It was something they had anticipated, perhaps feared. When they finished, the man in charge gestured for Ethan to follow him back outside. The moment they emerged from the cave, he spoke again, standing so close that Ethan could see the faint reflection of the trees in his pupils. "What you found here," he said softly, "is not for public knowledge, not for academic records, not for personal curiosity." His voice lowered further. "You signed non-disclosure agreements during your military service. Some subjects are not meant to be discussed, even years later. You understand this." Ethan stiffened. He had indeed signed NDAs, but not about anything remotely related to this. The man's statement was a thinly veiled threat, implying consequences he didn't dare ask about. "We appreciate your cooperation," the man continued, "and we strongly advise you to avoid returning here, or attempting to discuss what you saw." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Some discoveries are best buried." Back at the ranger station, Ethan watched the SUVs disappear down the dirt road until the dust settled and the forest swallowed their tracks. The air felt wrong, as though their presence had leached something vital from the land. He returned home that evening with the heaviness of the encounter weighing on him. As dusk spread across the sky, he reached for the steel lockbox beneath the floorboards and retrieved the scroll, setting it on the table once more. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the electric current of understanding that something far larger was unfolding. Something connected to the cave, the symbol he had recognized, and the heaviness he had felt in his chest since standing inside that ancient chamber. He lit a lamp and leaned forward, unrolling the scroll carefully until more of the text lay exposed. Hours passed as he examined the markings. Patterns emerged, repeating icons, spirals flanked by 3 strokes, horizontal bars with clustered symbols above them. He traced his fingers lightly along the ink, feeling its grooves. The writing told a story, though he didn't yet know how to read it, and every instinct in him whispered that this story was not meant for the men who had invaded the forest today. A phrase appeared frequently, composed of 3 distinct symbols, one resembling the outline of a gate, one a figure with outstretched arms, and one that looked like a series of jagged peaks. Over and over, this triad appeared. Ethan stared at it, trying to make sense of the pattern. His mind drifted to his grandmother's stories, tales of guardians who watched the mountains, protectors of in-between places where the world grew thin. He had always dismissed those stories as folklore. Now he wasn't so sure. He leaned closer, bringing the scroll almost to eye level. Something about the strokes, the way the symbols curved, hinted at motion, at cycles, at boundaries between things, between worlds. His breath caught. The symbol of the gate, the symbol of the mountain peaks, the symbol of the figure. Together they formed a phrase he could not translate, but somehow understood. Guardians, watchers of a threshold, protectors of something that should never be opened. A swell of unease rippled through him. The light from the lamp flickered, as though disturbed by a breath of wind, yet the windows were closed. Ethan sat back and scanned the room. His cabin was completely still. But outside the window, past the curtain of pine trees, a pair of headlights blinked out. He hadn't heard a vehicle approach. He moved quietly to the window and pushed aside the curtain just enough to see. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of his porch light, a dark SUV sat idling with its engine off, its occupants hidden from view. A moment later, the lights flickered on. The vehicle rolled backward slowly until it disappeared completely behind the trees. Ethan tightened his jaw. This wasn't surveillance. This was intimidation. He returned to the table, blowing out the lamp. Darkness filled the cabin except for the thin line of moonlight creeping in from the window. He placed the scroll back in the lockbox, lowered it beneath the floorboards, and sealed the hatch again. Whatever the cave contained, whatever the scroll revealed, he understood now that someone had spent decades searching for it, guarding it, and suppressing it. And that someone had just decided he knew too much. Sleep would not come to him that night. He sat in the dark, listening to the distant hum of wind against the cabin walls, thinking of the cold air inside the cave and the ancient jars lined in that forgotten chamber. Thinking of the operatives, who seemed determined to erase everything inside it. And thinking of the symbols, drawn on the scroll symbols, that tugged at something deep within his ancestry. something he had ignored all his life. By sunrise, one conclusion had settled in Ethan's mind with unshakable clarity. He needed to return to the cave before they did again. And he needed to uncover whatever truth lay hidden beneath that mountain before those men buried it forever. When he finally rose from the chair, exhaustion pulling at his eyes, he glanced once more out the window. The forest stood still and silent, but the silence no longer felt like an old companion. It felt like a warning. Ethan left the cabin long before dawn, moving through the half-light with measured, nearly soundless steps. The forest was still wrapped in night, the sky a deep shade of blue that hovered between darkness and morning. He had not slept more than an hour, but the exhaustion that should have weighed down his limbs instead sharpened his senses. The unease from the previous night had hardened into a cold determination. He could no longer pretend this was routine ranger work or ordinary chance. Whatever lay hidden beneath the mountain, the jars, the scrolls, the markings, was part of something larger, something that extended beyond academic curiosity or government jurisdiction. He felt it in the marrow of his bones, in the same place instincts lived, the place that had always warned him of approaching storms or lurking predators. But this was different. This danger was human, ancient, and newly awakened. He made his way through the trees without turning on his flashlight. He knew this forest too well to need one. The scent of pine was thicker than usual, mixing with the faint aroma of damp earth. The night had held a thin dew, and it clung to leaves and branches, sparkling faintly as dawn crept in. Somewhere in the distance, an owl gave a low, final call before retreating to its hidden roost. Otherwise, the forest was silent, but not in the peaceful way Ethan remembered. It felt as though the entire wilderness was watching, waiting for something to unfold. He moved quickly, cutting across a narrow clearing and up a slope where the trail forked. Instead of taking the marked path, he veered left into the undergrowth. He could have followed the main trail and easily reached the fissure again, but he didn't want to risk approaching from the same direction the operatives had taken. He needed an advantage, a different entry point, a route they had not discovered yet. So he followed his memory of the terrain, guiding himself by ridge lines and the faint hint of a dry stream bed that only filled during the wettest months of the year. As he climbed, the eastern horizon began to brighten, setting the sky ablaze with pale gold. He paused at the crest of the ridge to catch his breath and look back toward the valley. His cabin lay hidden among the trees far below, a small speck swallowed by the immensity of the forest. Standing there, he realized how few people truly understood the depth of these mountains, how many secrets lay buried beneath their stone flesh. For years he had felt a peculiar sense of belonging here, as if drawn to the quiet spaces others overlooked. Now he wondered if that pull had been coincidence, or something older and more inexplainable. Something tied to the scroll he had begun to decipher. He descended the ridge and approached the area where he suspected a second, narrower entrance might exist. When he had first explored the cave, he had noticed a cluster of fissures near the slope, nearly hidden beneath layers of lichen and fallen branches. They had been too small to examine properly at night, but daylight revealed thin cracks that extended deeper into the rock face. Ethan knelt and brushed away some debris, revealing a gap no wider than his shoulders. The air escaping through the fissure was the same cold, metallic draft he had felt inside the chamber. This was it, a secondary entrance, perhaps formed when the mountain shifted. He removed his pack and took a deep breath, leaning into the gap. The opening narrowed further, forcing him to twist his shoulders sideways and propel himself inch by inch along the stone corridor. His boots scraped against the floor, sending small stones skittering ahead into the darkness. For a moment, claustrophobia threatened to rise in his chest, but he pushed it aside. The passage slowly widened, giving him room to crouch and then to stand. He turned on his flashlight. The beam illuminated a narrow chamber with walls smoother than natural erosion could produce. Symbols covered the stone-faded carvings of figures, jagged peaks, spirals, and shapes resembling gates. The markings were identical to those on the scroll. This was not a simple cave. It was a constructed space, a sanctuary carved with intention. The air smelled of old dust and something faintly sweet, like dried sap. Ethan stepped forward, his footsteps echoing hollowly across the stone. He followed the sloping floor deeper until the chamber gave way to a spiraling tunnel that descended into darkness. The walls here bore more intricate carvings, each groove deep enough to run a finger through. The symbols grew more complex the farther he went. Some appeared to depict rituals, circles of figures around fire pits, others kneeling before towering shapes with outstretched limbs. Ethan paused before one fresco that seemed to show a figure holding a staff made of light, standing between two warring silhouettes. The carved lines radiated outward like sun rays or cracks in the fabric of reality. A shiver ran down his spine. He wondered how many centuries had passed since the hands that carved these images last touched the stone. He moved onward until the tunnel opened into a vast underground hall. The chamber was so large that his flashlight beam only reached a fraction of the ceiling, where veins of quartz reflected the light like distant stars. Ethan walked further inside, raising the beam across the walls. Murals covered every surface scenes of mountains, storms, celestial bodies, and robed figures who stood at the borders of worlds. The stories etched into the walls seemed to depict the rise and fall of a civilization unlike any described in known history. And there, at the center of the chamber, stood a massive stone platform. Its surface was polished smooth, though time had left faint cracks along its edges. A cluster of scrolls lay arranged upon it, wrapped in age-old leather and bound with braided fibers. Ethan's breath caught. These were untouched. The operatives had never reached this place. He approached the platform reverently. His flashlight illuminated the largest scroll positioned apart from the others. It was adorned with a single symbol, one that matched the repeated triad he had seen on the scroll hidden beneath his floorboards. The gate, the figure, the peaks. The symbol seemed to glow faintly under the beam of light, though he knew it was only his imagination. Still, he felt drawn to it. When he reached out and lifted the scroll, a deep sense of recognition washed over him. The leather was surprisingly warm, as though holding its own internal heat. He unbound the cord and slowly unfurled the scroll. The ink was dark and rich, preserved in the cool depths of the mountain. The writing was more elaborate than the previous scroll, with longer sequences of symbols and punctuation marks dividing the text into sections. Though he could not read the language, he sensed meaning in the patterns. Suddenly, a memory surfaced, the memory of sitting beside his grandmother when he was a child, listening to her recite old stories about guardians who watched over hidden gateways in the mountains. Stories he had dismissed as superstition. His grandmother had always insisted their family descended from people who protected sacred places, who kept balance between seen and unseen worlds. Ethan had believed her stories were metaphors for respecting nature. But now, standing in a hall carved by hands from an ancient and forgotten culture, staring at symbols that echoed the tales she told, he felt a surge of something he could not name, something like belonging, something like destiny. He traced the lines of the scroll, feeling the grooves left by the original scribe. Then, faintly at first, he heard a sound. Footsteps. His pulse hammered. The sound echoed from the tunnel behind him. He extinguished his flashlight, plunging the chamber into near darkness, illuminated only by faint reflections from the quartz veins above. He pressed himself behind the stone platform, clutching the scroll to his chest. Voices drifted toward him, muffled by distance, but unmistakably human. They were speaking in low tones, moving with purposeful steps. The men in black had returned, and this time they had found the hidden passage. Ethan held his breath as beams of light pierced the chamber from the tunnel entrance. Shadows from the operatives' flashlights danced across the murals like restless spirits. Their footsteps echoed, heavy and confident. They were searching the chamber with a pattern familiar to tactical teams, grid-like movement, dividing their coverage to locate a target. Ethan counted at least 3 voices, maybe 4. He carefully slid along the floor toward the side wall, where he had noticed a narrow crack earlier. The operative's light swept dangerously close to his position. He moved slowly, silently, pressing his back against the cold stone until he found the crack. It was small, but just wide enough to squeeze through. He slipped inside, scraping his shoulder as he did, and found himself in a cramped passage leading upward. The operatives' voices grew louder behind him. They had reached the center platform. One of them barked, "The artifacts were moved! Someone's been here!" The tone held no doubt, only anger. Ethan climbed upward, ignoring the pain in his arms as he leveraged himself through the narrow passage. The tunnel twisted before opening into a small chamber, with another jagged crevice leading toward the surface. He could feel cool air drifting through. He forced himself through the gap until he emerged onto a sloping hillside covered in loose gravel and low brush. He was outside, free. Below him, the voices inside the cave echoed faintly against the stone. The operatives would not stay underground long once they realized he had escaped. He needed to move quickly. Still holding the scroll, he sprinted across the slope and toward a rocky outcropping where he could descend into a lower section of the forest without leaving obvious tracks. The sun had fully risen now, casting long beams of light between the trees. The warmth on his skin felt surreal after the chilled depths of the cave. He descended the hill and reached a dense patch of pines. There, hidden among the roots, he paused to catch his breath. The scroll was still in his hand, its warmth persistent, almost comforting. He glanced back up the slope. At any moment he expected to see the operatives burst through the trees. He knew he couldn't keep running blindly. He needed proof, something that would expose what was happening. The scrolls in the mountain told a story too old and too important to vanish into government archives. He had taken photographs of the murals and secondary carvings while inside the cave, using the small camera built into his Ranger radio. The device stored images on an encrypted memory chip meant for documenting crimes or natural disasters. Ethan reached into his pocket to check it. The chip was still there. He rose and began moving deeper into the forest, following a hidden trail that led toward a high ridge. If he could reach the summit, he could use the old Firewatch cabin, a place with a clear vantage point, and, more importantly, a satellite link built into an emergency terminal. It was outdated, but functional enough to send large data packets if patience was exercised. The ascent was steep, and the exertion strained his already exhausted muscles. But he climbed without slowing, fueled by adrenaline and the weighted knowledge that if the operatives caught him, the scroll and the truth it carried would vanish forever. When he reached the summit, the cabin appeared like a ghost of another era. Weather-beaten boards, a rusted metal roof, a door that creaked on its hinge. He entered and bolted the door behind him, though he knew it would not stop men with the tools and authority to break into anything. Still, the symbolic act gave him a moment of breath. Inside the cabin, dust motes drifted in the sunlight that filtered through cracks in the walls. The emergency terminal was mounted in the corner, its old screen covered by a thin layer of grime. Ethan brushed his sleeve over it and powered it on. The machine hummed loudly, as though startled from a decades-long sleep. He inserted the memory chip and watched as the images loaded. Photos of the murals, of the carvings, of the scrolls arranged on the platform. Evidence no one could ignore if seen by the right people. He connected to the satellite link and began sending the files. It was slow, painfully slow, but the progress bar inched forward. He sent them to multiple recipients, independent archaeologists, journalists known for exposing government secrecy, university departments that specialized in prehistoric civilizations, and several trusted friends from his military days who had both clearance and conscience. He watched the progress bar climb, 20%, 35, 50. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. The cabin creaked under an unseen weight, and for a moment Ethan thought he heard footsteps outside. He tensed, listening. The forest was quiet. The progress bar reached 70%, then 80, then 90. He held his breath. At 100%, the screen flashed confirmation. Files sent. Copies delivered. Even if the operatives destroyed everything now, it would be too late. The truth was loose. A moment later, the ground trembled beneath his feet. A low rumble rolled through the ridge, rattling the cabin walls. Ethan rushed to the window. Far below, a plume of dust rose from the mountainside where the cave entrance had been. The operatives had triggered an explosive charge. They had sealed the cave permanently. He closed his eyes. Relief washed through him, not because he had destroyed their access, but because he had managed to preserve the truth before they could erase it. He stood there for a long moment, breathing deeply, feeling the scroll warm in his hands. The forest was quiet again, but not with the ominous silence of before. This silence felt earned, as though the land itself acknowledged what had happened, as though the mountains, ancient and patient, recognized him now, not just as a ranger, but as something more, a guardian of the threshold he never knew existed. Ethan stepped out of the cabin and looked across the endless expanse of forest and stone. The sun was high, the wind gentle, carrying with it the scent of pine and the faint echo of something older than memory. He felt no triumph, only clarity. His life had changed forever. The world, too, would soon begin to shift under the weight of the truths he had released. And standing on the edge of the ridge, with the warmth of the ancient scroll radiating through his hands, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that the mountains had chosen him for a reason he had only just begun to understand. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and check out the next videos on the channel. Share this video with someone who loves real mysteries.